Welcome everyone to LRO2. We are going to be going over generalizing arguments. In particular, we'll be using parallel reasoning as an example, but as I will mention later on in the lesson, the paraphrasing skill, the generalizing skill, is going to be applicable on a pretty broad swath of the exam. So a preview of what we're going to be going over. Last time I did go on several boomerific rants about how a good LR score can be obtained from using techniques, tips, and tricks, that sort of thing, but a great LR score comes from beating the LSAC's language trickery. So today's lesson is going to demonstrate how to beat the LSAC's language trickery by using paraphrasing / generalization. I use those terms interchangeably, but I prefer generalization, mostly because paraphrasing has this connotation of not quite getting rid of all of the words that the original person used, and when I generalize, I tend to try as much as possible to get rid of those original words, so that's why I use generalization. So the demonstration today is going to focus on parallel reasoning and parallel flaw questions, but as I just said, generalizing works on principal questions, paradox questions, or really any question where the writing is bad. So anytime you're having trouble getting a handle on detailed language, dense concepts, weird stuff, generalizing is going to help you out. The bonus here is that, as a sort of bonus additional benefit to all this, the generalizing skills we will cover here are also excellent for reading comp. So for those of you who have seen my reading comp lesson, it focuses on reading a little bit less, reading faster, that sort of thing. And instead, we are going to be focused in reading comp on reading for structure, not necessarily the actual details, but reading for the structure. That's pretty much exactly what I'm going to demonstrate here. In some ways, I should have done it in my RC lesson, but just because passages are long, I didn't want to quite do that. But here, we have some good short opportunities to demonstrate generalization in a small parallel reasoning argument-sized package. The first thing I want to do is actually revisit a concept that underpinned the last lesson, namely logical hostility. So again, hostility is essentially you insultingly waving your hand at the arguer's face and saying, dude, I don't care. So you're really telling me that believe conclusion C because of premise P and just kind of dismissing that. That is what we mean when I talk about hostility. The importance of hostility is that it allows you to dismiss the authority of the arguer. And that's more important than it sounds. Being able to dismiss the authority of an arguer improves your ability to ignore the specific and often poorly written facts that the arguer throws at you, and instead generalize their argument into generic variables like A and B. In turn, that generalization allows you to better observe the relationship between the elements of the argument instead of getting bogged down in the confusing word soup of weird facts and intentionally bad writing that a lot of these arguments consist of. So with that general dismissiveness, hostility in mind, so that we're not too concerned about actually being nice to our arguer and we're really just in the mental habit of breaking down what they're saying rather than building them up, let's get into actually generalizing. Our first goal when we generalize is to the maximum extent possible generalize the content of the argument. Our next goal, once we've generalized the specific facts of people into variables like X, Y, Z, just plain old letters or numbers, whatever works better for you. Our next goal is to describe how the variables interact. So I will mention this near the very end of today's lesson, but this should be fairly reminiscent of LG, what you're doing in games. This is in many ways the same cognitive task. It's just an LG. Instead of you needing to take the step of reading words and turning them into variables, sometimes LG is nice and just gives us entities as variables and letters instead of names or other things that we have to turn into letters. But we end up with kind of the same thing. So rather than keep it abstract as I always do, we will jump right into a demonstration of what generalizing actually looks like on the section. And to that end, parallel reasoning and parallel flaw are pretty much the best place to demonstrate it because the questions literally require you to do some form of this. So we will be revisiting our familiar friend, the June 07 exam, section 2, question 9. Take a minute to read the argument if you're not familiar with this one already. Pause the video, do whatever. But if you're ready to move on, let's move on together. I see two premises here. The first premise, the arguer opens up by talking about some kind of promise to keep confidence or to keep a secret, basically. They then add premise 2, which adds a new concept to that. For some situations, i.e. questions when the arguer is being asked the question, answering those questions truthfully forces them to break that promise to keep confidence. So I've highlighted certain things in red and blue here. Keeping confidence seems to be the important, interesting concept of premise 1. Premise 2, the concept of telling the truth, seems to be placed in opposition to that original red concept of keeping confidence. So that's why telling the truth is now coded in a different color blue as opposed to the original concept keeping confidence red. And finally, the last sentence does get to a conclusion here. Therefore, when it comes to questions, you can't be obliged to always tell the truth and keep all your promises. And so I see the tell the truth part is lines up pretty cleanly from premise 2 in the conclusion. The keep all promises, though, is problematic. So adding some highlights here just to make sure that everyone's following along. Originally in the premises, what stood out to me was the idea of keeping confidence specifically. That was my red concept in the premises, and the blue concept, telling the truth, was what I picked up in premise 2. Like I just said, I see telling the truth is consistent between premise 2 and the conclusion. But by the time I get to the conclusion, the red concept seems to have shifted to keeping all promises. So yeah, initially, this is an accurate reflection of how the process worked for me when I was doing this question live before recording this. This is exactly what I thought. Thankfully, there's a pretty easy fix. So again, the problem is that the conclusion seems to have picked up on the keep all promises, the promise concept from the premises. Whereas when I initially read the premises, I thought instead of the promise part, it was specifically the keeping confidence part that I should have kept track of. But like I just said, there's a pretty easy fix to that. So we literally fixed the problem by following what the arguer is doing. So if the conclusion clearly wants to keep track of how promises are treated, then that's what we also want to do in the premises as well. So we just literally shift the red the red coloring from keeping confidence to the promises aspect of it, because that seems to be how the mechanism of the argument works. So having now shifted our attention away from the confidence concept to the promise concept, so that the premises and the conclusion kind of stay consistent. Now we are going to actually do the first generalization. So the text is going to change kind of suddenly, but it's not going to be that hard, just kind of keep up. So I'm going to translate the red promise concept into the variable x, and that's quite literally what I will show you next here. And through the magic of PowerPoint and video editing, we have now transformed every reference of promise into some form of x. So premise 1 turns into do x. That means promise to keep confidence. Premise 2 changes into, for some questions, telling the truth forces me not to do X. So it's a pretty, generalization is as simple as it sounds and as it looks here. It's literally just taking concepts and crushing them down into variables. And finally, conclusion, also remember, had the whole promise concept as well. And in there, we transform promises into X. And so we get, therefore, when it comes to answering questions, you can't be obliged to always tell the truth and do X. So just as we did with the red concepts, we turned the promise concept into the variable x, I will be now transforming the telling the truth concept into y. And here it is. We've now transformed every reference to telling the truth into y. I probably don't really need to read it out again to you, but I will give you a minute in case looking at this and your reading speed doesn't quite keep up with me chattering away out loud. But yeah, all we've done, if you want to compare the previous slide to this one, we've transformed the telling the truth concept, that text, into y. And now finally, after having done this red and blue stuff, I like to look to see if there's any other text to simplify. So let's see what that looks like here. So on the hunt for things other than red and blue that we can simplify, my eye is drawn to premise 2, specifically the bit about the context of premise 2 being in the context of being asked questions. So for some questions, telling the truth forces me not to be able to keep confidence or keep that promise of keeping confidence. So again, for some questions, doing Y forces me to not do X. I think we can simplify this for some questions into just sometimes, like so. So having done that to the premises, we must also remember that the conclusion was pretty consistent and was also talking about when it comes to being asked questions. You can't be obliged to always do Y and do X. So we will make that change in the conclusion as well to see what we get. So we're just going to take the highlighted text here and collapse it into the word sometimes, like so, and we kind of get a weird result. Sometimes you can't be obliged to always do Y and do X at the same time. So let's just think about that for a second. Sometimes you can't always do something else. The word sometimes there, even though it was an accurate logical carryover from the change we made to premise 2 to the conclusion, when we apply it to the text of the conclusion, it becomes a meaningless thing. Sometimes you can't always do everything. That just means the same thing as you can't always do everything. Or specifically, sometimes you can't do Z means, or excuse me, sometimes you can't always do Z is the same thing as you can't always do Z. That sometimes modifier doesn't really do anything for us. So actually, we can just drop it entirely. And having done that, we end up with something that looks like this. Premise 1, do X. Premise 2, sometimes doing Y forces me not to do X. And the conclusion is, you can't always be obliged to do Y and to do X at the same time. And so again, this result is pretty simple, and really, I took, X number of minutes to get you guys there, but really it's another one of those many things on this exam where it's just harder to explain than it is to actually do. So hopefully the example is simple enough and my explanations were clear enough. Again, there are several ways to get hold of me. Comments are a good way. Reddit is another good way, but the email also is a good way. If you feel like I've moved through it and you still have some questions that I didn't really address, feel free to reach out. But again, it's not that hard. It really isn't that hard to get from point A to point B, to get from the stimulus to a very simple variable generalization like this one. I want to point out here, just take a second to appreciate how utterly simple this argument is when you remove almost all the specific context. So we have basically done that, right? And here's the thing. If the variables and the algebra sounding thing isn't your kind of thing, you don't even need variables. If more natural sounding language is better for you, it'll look something like this. I do a thing. Sometimes doing another thing makes it impossible to also do that first thing that I mentioned. Therefore, there are times when I can't be expected to do both things at once. Clearly, the natural sounding language, quote unquote, requires more words because we're kind of talking in full sentences like a human being. And this way can also make it hard to differentiate between all those things, right? There's a reason why we have names for different things, because if we call everything thing, we're not going to be able to communicate more complex ideas, right? All that being said, I have met some people who operate better this way, and truth be told, sometimes when I'm dealing with just two variables like X and Y, as we did in this stimulus, sometimes I just naturally default to this because in my head, even when I'm thinking to myself, I tend to use more natural sounding language than that algebraic sounding XYZ stuff. So what I want to highlight though is that reading this generalization, this paraphrase, you'd actually have no clue that it was originally about promises to keep confidence or to answer questions truthfully. And that is exactly the concept. A successful generalization is going to actually make it relatively difficult for you to look at the generalization and actually tell what the original argument was about in terms of the specific facts. What you do capture in a generalization is the interrelationship between X, Y, and Z and all those other variables that we figured out. So now that we've successfully generalized the stimulus into something that is much less specific to promises and truth-telling and reduced down to just X and Y, let's do the answer choices, getting back to the question itself. A actually looks pretty good right off the bat. We start with the concept X. We can say whatever we want all the time, unfettered freedom of expression. But then we have Y, an obligation to be civil. This Y concept prevents us from also having X. And then the conclusion is X and Y can't be true at the same time. One small nitpick I have with A, though, is that to me, our stimulus didn't necessarily make it sound like X and Y were flat out mutually exclusive. You can never have X and Y at the same time. And that really wasn't, to me, what the stimulus was telling us. Really, the stimulus sounded like it was saying just that always X and always Y, a regime like that is impossible. Because we know that there's at least one situation where X and Y from the stimulus are incompatible. Sometimes answering a question truthfully and keeping in confidence, or upholding a promise to keep confidence. Sometimes we know that there's at least one situation in which those two things are not possible, but unlike answer choice A, I feel like the stimulus leaves room for us to believe that there are other times when you can do both of those things at the same time, whereas the way A is written, it's, just these two things are flat out mutually exclusive. Ultimately, I don't think this is a big enough problem to not pick A, but it is honestly a thought that crossed my mind, and I never pretend in any of these videos like I don't get such doubts. And that's really because that's really not my experience as a test taker or as an instructor. Students tell me all the time that the reason that they're looking for one-on-one guidance is that you look at something, I'm not really going to name names because I don't want to throw shade on other test prep folks, because this is just kind of a consequence not of poor teaching but of just the limits of pre-recorded instruction. it always seems so clear when you read someone else's wrong answer choice explanation or right answer choice explanation that the right answer is right and the wrong answer is wrong. It always seems so clear, but of course, when you are doing it yourself, it isn't that clear, right? You have these questions. I'm the same way, and I want to reassure you that to the extent that I can't, or to the extent that I can, because sometimes I think for format reasons it would be difficult for me to do it every single time. But to the maximum extent that I can, I will always reflect how I was thinking, and a lot of times I have these doubts. So, I mean, if you want to see someone pretend like the right answer is like a 10,000%, obviously the better one, then you can go look at any other test prep place and you'll get exactly that. So even though I kind of liked A, I did have that one nitpick. So on in a testing situation, I would go through and check the others real quick. B looks awful. Looks absolutely terrible. This one basically says some can only get X if they do Y, but Y does Z. We should stop right now. It only gets weirder and more irrelevant from the stimulus here. There was no if and only if or formal logic, sort of one thing leads to another or one thing requires something else. There was none of that going on in our stimulus. So pretty clearly, I think we can eliminate B from the running. We move along to C now, having eliminated B, and C unfortunately looks just as awful. It tells us if we do X, our client might think Y bad thing. If we don't do X, client might think Z bad thing. Either way, we risk the client thinking bad things. This is in no way what we're looking for. Again, it's not the most terrible logic out there, but again, it's not the logic that we're looking for. That brings us to D, which is getting a big fat nope from me. There's a whole chain of reasoning in here to start us off, and that's a pretty bad sign. It's not a guarantee of wrongness per se, because sometimes I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, there was an old question where the stimulus didn't present information as a chain, but the correct answer did have an element of sort of chaining logic, formal logic together. But at the same time, since we didn't see any sort of progression from one thing to another in our stimulus, that's a red flag for me. I already don't like this one. The next sentence in the answer choice further extends the chain, so that's just yet another big red flag for me. Nothing about this so far looks right. Personally, at this point, I'd stop here, because again, there was simply no cascading sort of this leads to that and that leads to yet another thing flow to the stimulus, but that's exactly what we've gotten so far in D. But if you really must know, it sounds like if big X and little x, then you get Y. If you get Y, then you get Z. But we don't have Z, so we're either missing X or we're missing little x. And so this is about debt collection, right? If you have a legitimate claim, that's big X, and the payer and the debtor has the means to pay that debt, little x, then you should collect Y. And if you are legitimately able to collect Y, then you have Z concept, which is courts can enforce it. But if a court can't enforce it, that must mean that you're missing either a legitimate claim or you're missing the ability to pay. And so here, the final note that I'd like to make before burying D for good is that the formal logic actually isn't flawed. They're trying to do a sort of contrapositive here. Even though it's not flawed, it's just simply not what we're looking for. This breakdown that I gave you, big X, little x, Z, that looks nothing like what we had for our original stimulus. So that brings us now to E. E is another big nope. If we do X, then we have to do Y or Z. We can just stop here. It's in no way what we had. This, if you have one option, it branches into two options. Not at all what we had. So since B through E were all pretty solid no, it looks like A is the one that we pick. I figure we should do one more for practice just to demonstrate a few other tricks the LSAC likes to throw at people. The previous question that we did was fairly straightforward. Yeah, we had that little slip up early on where initially on my first read through I thought the premises should really be focused on the keeping confidence concept, but it signaled to me in the conclusion that instead of keeping confidence, the arguer was much more concerned about the promise aspect of keeping confidence. So, but that was an easy enough shift, right? Once we kind of lined those things up, all the elements kind of fell into place. It was fairly straightforward, and answer choice A was very strong aside from that really minor nitpick that ultimately turned out not to matter. So, pretty simple. This one that we're about to do is a little bit less so. So this is from the same exam, but section 3, question number 20, and this is a parallel flaw. The generalization skill is going to be more or less the same, but because it is a parallel flaw, it's generally good practice to try to figure out what actually the flaw is, just to give us a better chance at identifying the correct response. So here we have sort of two elements to premise one. it kind of starts us off, well, by in writing, it starts us off with the conclusion. But our first premise, after they hit us with the conclusion, is that the local historical society is vehemently opposed to a proposal to demolish the old train station. And furthermore, the same local historical society is dominated by people who have no commitment to long-term economic well-being. So this to me is already a very suspicious argument. Not every ad hominem-ish argument is wrong. It is fair in some contexts, especially in litigation, to question the motives or the potential conflicts of interest of whoever's trying to tell you something. Because if something that somebody says is not on its face wrong, but you have very good reason to believe that they are misleading is a strong word, but they are presenting this information with a heavy bias. Let's just put it that way. That could be a valid point to raise in certain circumstances. So it's not default the wrong thing to do, but it's generally not a very smart thing to do. And so that's already got my spidey sense tingling, so to speak. I really don't like this argument to begin with, right off the bat here. Then we move on to premise 2, and I'm not even sure this matters, and I'll explain why I have questions about it, but we do seem to have a second premise, which is that preserving old buildings impedes development, and development is in turn critical to economic health. So I feel like maybe the economic health aspect of this premise is going to matter, but I'm not sure what this interstitial impeding development step is going to, whether or not that's going to play a role, because technically they could have just said preserving old buildings kind of gets in the way of preserving or promoting economic health, because that's kind of the point. That's the only reason why the reference to development is in there, but we'll see how that plays out. And finally, we will revisit the conclusion, which was actually written first on our page here. The conclusion is that we should accept the proposal to demolish the old train station. So let's begin by trying our best to generalize this into variables. So I'm not going to be quite as step-by-step as I was for the first one, because again, the concept is pretty simple. You've seen me do it before. I'm just going to try my best to break it up into at least reasonable chunks for you guys to follow. So translating our argument, we get this. Group X, the historical society, opposes activity Y, demolishing the old station. And furthermore, Group X doesn't have interest Z, long-term economic health, at heart. So again, our original premise I've collapsed into three variables. They're criticizing a group, or kind of accusing them of something, but they're saying that this group X, opposes activity Y, and furthermore, Group X doesn't have interest Z at heart. Premise 2. And again, I just don't really know how to deal with the Y and Z not lining up completely, but that's also why this argument is kind of bad, and we'll address that later on. But for the time being, it seems like not doing Y, not demolishing old buildings, does W. And W is critical, impedes W. And W in turn is critical to Z, economic health. And so the Y and Z don't line up because the Y originally in our premise 1 was specifically demolishing the old train station. But the Y concept in premise 2 is actually about demolishing old buildings in general. And of course, there's that whole question about whether W really matters or not, because it seems like W exists only to bridge the gap between Y and Z here. But at least the Z part more or less lines up. There is a little bit of a question in my mind about how exactly Z lines up here. Because if you look at it, premise 2 is talking about long-term economic health, right? Or excuse me, just regular economic health. Premise 1 is talking about long-term economic health. I'm just going to, just because I don't want to add like a fourth variable by adding like Z prime or something, like a version of Z to premise 2 that's not the same as the version of Z we get in premise 1. That's starting to overcomplicate things in my mind. So I'm, for now, not going to bother with adjusting Z in any way. And I'm also not going to bother with adjusting Y. I'm going to see how far I can go just pretending that the language in premise 2 more or less exactly reflects the language in premise 1. And finally, we get to the conclusion, which is simply, and this one is at least simple, we should approve Y. So that was a lot of talking because I didn't really feel comfortable with premise 2, but really if you kind of just hold that discomfort in the back of your mind and just say, okay, maybe this is another example of the LSAT fudging their own language standards, we at least get to move on, and we can kind of see how the version of Y that they have in premise 2 lines up with the version of Y they have in premise 1. Same thing with Z. So having done that, I do want to give you guys a version of the natural language version, so to speak, which we'll do on the next slide right here. So again, just for reference, we have the variable version of our argument here. Because x supposes y, but x doesn't care about z, and not doing y prevents w, and w is critical to z, we should approve y. The more natural sounding version is kind of hard to pull off because we have so many variables. Repeating the generic word thing a ton of times is unhelpful. So I did end up resorting to using some variables anyway, but this is what it would sound like in more complete sentences. The people opposing y don't care about important issue z. Not doing stuff like y gets in the way of w, and w is critical to z. So we should do y. So now that we've chosen to generalize either in this sort of algebraic format or in the more natural language format that we just went over, now that we've done that, what's the actual flaw here, aside from the obvious ad hominem-esque attack on party X? When looking at what we have, it looks like everything boils down to Z. The arguer says that Y, demolitions, clear the path for W, development, which we need for Z, economic health. Furthermore, the X people who don't want Y are accused of not caring about Z. So it seems like Z matters a lot to our arguer. So Z matters a lot, but then that begs the question, okay dude, we get it, you love Z. But is Z really all that matters? That is the question you should always be asking yourself in this sort of situation, and we're going to get into it. We'll get into the nature of that question and why it's so important on the next slide here. So as promised, unpacking the question. So, okay dude, we get that you love Z, but is Z really all that matters? This line of questioning that I suggest here is widely applicable to both LR and actually argumentation in real life. I would say arguably this question is kind of the general form of most arguments. We should do thing A because of reason B. That's kind of how everyone argues on a basic level, right? You should do thing A because of reason B. When an arguer presents B as pretty much the sole justification to do A, logic demands that we question if B actually is enough to justify A. So again, if somebody's only reason to justify doing A is the reason B, we logically would like to question, is B actually enough justification? You're saying that it is, but is it actually enough? So think of this as an example. You approach, just for example, like a celebrity, somebody famous, an actor, musician, whatever, someone who's clearly doing awesome in life and having a great time not being a lawyer. So you walk up to this person and you say, hey, you should take the LSAT because you need to do that in order to go to law school. So just before you get tackled by a big old security guard, the celebrity's retort should be, if they're thinking logically, what if I don't want to go to law school like at all, right? So this is how that example works. So just because reason B, going to law school, is undeniably factually related to A, taking the LSAT, just because that relationship is factual and real, doesn't mean that the conversation is over and that the arguer won. That's not the end of the story. There could be any number of non-B considerations that impact the wisdom of accepting A as an outcome. So again, if you present B as the one and only reason that you should just accept A, that means that B is more important than everything else. And of course, in an argument, if all you say is you should do A just because of B, you haven't actually specified, you haven't made clear to me that B really is the only reason that you need to do A. So let's bring that back into our question. Looking back at the question, we can actually realize that what the arguer has done here is very similar to the do A because of reason B. It takes the form of this. Approve Y, demolition, because of Z, economic health. Ignore the jerks X who don't care about Z. That's kind of the extra flair that the arguer's added. But otherwise, it's a pretty basic argument. Approve of a certain course of action because of economic reasons. So to adapt that question to this situation here, we need to ask ourselves, is Z really the be-all, end-all consideration when it comes to approving or denying Y? And generally speaking, almost always, and in this particular situation, the answer is no. It is not the be-all, end-all. Or at least the arguer has not successfully established that it is the be-all, end-all. They've just said it, but they haven't actually justified why that's the case. Because there could be any number of reasons aside from economic health that impact the decision to demolish. So some examples, maybe demolition is too expensive. That's a common one, right? Maybe it would constitute a health hazard to undertake the demolition. A lot of old buildings have asbestos and other old, outdated, toxic materials, and so blowing it up is going to give everybody cancer 5 years from now. That's a reason not to do it, right? Um, or maybe even perhaps the old station is a landmark and the locals don't actually want it gone. They kind of like it. They want it around. None of those considerations are part of the discussion. This arguer just barged into our house and just said, "Hey, do demolition because of economic health," as if that's the end of the discussion, and it's not. There's so many things that they haven't addressed that are relevant. But instead, they're kind of pretending like none of them are without having logically established that none of them are as relevant as Z. So, while questioning the motives, so now to address the ad hominem aspect of this, questioning the motives of your opponents isn't always an instant loss, like I said. It's not instantly a losing situation. But it's a bad move here because the attack that they do doesn't really add anything to the argument. It shares the same weakness with the rest of the premises, an unexplained obsession with Z. The ad hominem attack would matter, I think, if it gave us some new information that was relevant, but it does the same old thing. It just basically circles us back to the importance of Z, economic health. So that's another thing that's wrong with it. So to kind of recap because I've said a lot of different things, to recap where we are so far, we've generalized the argument and we've discovered the flaw. And again, the flaws really, there are two, if you want to put it that way. The arguer assumes that Z is pretty much the only thing that matters when it comes to making a decision about Y, without establishing the primacy of Z in the premises. So they may not be wrong. Z could indeed be the one and only thing, or at least the thing that matters the absolute most when it comes to deciding why. But nothing that they've told us actually proves that Z matters as much as they're pretending it does. The second potential error that if we're trying to pull this whole thing apart is that the arguer also chooses to jab at their opponents, party X, the historical society. But ultimately, that jab fails to escape from the primacy of Z, while also continuing to fail to establish that primacy. So, in attacking the historical society, they're stuck still talking about Z, and their attack on the society doesn't actually help them establish why Z is so important. They're just basically pretending like Z is important. Everybody knows that. We don't know that. They haven't told us anything that indicates that Z actually matters that much. So really, moving forward from here, I'm going to be looking for an answer choice that has a similar structure and hopefully does both of those errors that we just talked about here. So again, the errors are the arguer has set things up such that Z is the only thing that matters when it comes to deciding whether or not to do Y, but they haven't actually factually established that Z matters that much or that Z matters more than anything else. And to compound that, they also make the questionable choice to begin attacking opponents of the argument while also failing to address the Z problem. In fact, their attack on their opponents is still stuck in the same swirling toilet bowl vortex of not being able to escape from the importance of Z without having explained why Z is important in the first place. So starting right up with answer choice A, this one's a pretty solid no. It basically says we should do Y because we ought to spend money doing Y whenever we can. They do throw in a jab at Group X, but they're not at all questioning X's priorities, and they don't actually come out and accuse X of actually opposing Y. They're just saying that the general public and critics don't value the artworks, but they're not accusing those two groups of people of being opposed to the preservation. So yeah, this is just a miss on all fronts. And there's also no mention of the W factor, right? Remember that? We haven't had occasion to mention W ever since our initial diagram. So like I said, I already had questions about the relevance of W and its conspicuous absence from our first answer choice. It doesn't confirm it, but it's beginning to push me further in the direction of thinking, okay, maybe W really doesn't matter. And again, the reason why I didn't think W mattered in the first place was that the sole reason for W's existence was to bridge a gap between Y and Z, bridge a gap between demolition and economic health. And so really the purpose of that was just to say demolition is necessary for economic health. So it feels like the W concept, the development concept, doesn't really matter anyway. Moving on to B, this one's a probably no. Not quite as firmly no for me as A was. So B for us says that we should do Y, preserve stuff, because of Z, not damaging the historical record is important. This part isn't bad, but the argument lacks an attack on X. So again, I'm not 100% sure that the attack is necessary because really there's enough problem with assuming that Z is so important that it alone is enough to explain why. But I am ideally looking for an ad hominem jab in there somewhere that mirrors the one we had in our stimulus. So that's why I'm downgrading the hard no to just a probably no, but it's still probably no. And also, I'm going to note that, like in A, there, W, that development concept, that interstitial concept, makes no appearance. So W is looking less and less relevant to me the further along we go. That brings us to C, and I rate this one as a probably yes at this point. It says that we should do Y, don't get haircuts more than once a month, because X, the group X, the hair people, oppose Y. They actually want you to get 2 haircuts a month, which is not doing Y, getting 1 haircut a month max. And they do that, they oppose Y for reason Z, their self-interest. I'll call it Z prime. I had to call it Z prime instead of Z because in the stimulus, Z was something that the arguer wanted, economic health. That's something that the arguer thought was a good thing. Whereas in answer choice C, the Z prime turns out to be something that the group X, not the arguer, wants. So if it was exactly parallel, the Z prime here would be something that the historical society wanted, whereas Z in our stimulus was something that the arguer wanted. Aside from that, admittedly hair-splitting, fine-tuned criticism, it is looking pretty good. It does consider one factor, self-interest, as pretty much the whole reason to follow a certain other course of action, getting haircuts at a certain rate. And it also has the proper ad hominem jab. It's saying that we shouldn't take a course of action because the people opposed to that course of action have bad motivations. So it's not quite as exact as I would like in most situations, but so far, I mean, it's a hell of a lot better than B and C, or excuse me, A and B, and it has most of what I'm looking for in all the right places. Again, I want to make a note that the whole W concept is just nowhere in sight. I am even further leaning towards the idea that W is irrelevant because I do like this answer choice. C, it's probably going to be the right one by my feeling so far, and it doesn't care about W at all. So I'm not really even. I'm just pretty much going to stop looking for it at this point. I will try to keep it in the back of my mind such that if under the circumstance that D or E happens to throw that out of left field at us, I'll know how to deal with it. But really, I'm not going to go hunting for it. It's not going to be part of my standard for judging whether something is parallel or not. So let's move along to D. This is a pretty solid no for me. It includes a discussion of group X, which is kind of one of the things we're looking for. But if you read it, the arguer is actually saying we should agree with what the X people are saying. That's not at all how our stimulus works. For that reason alone, we can just get rid of it, I think. And that brings us to E, which again is a pretty solid no for me. This argument just has the form of one thing leads to another, which leads to another. So that was a problem that we saw in our previous question too, right? There was an answer choice that provided cascaded reasoning. Not only is the do Y because of reason Z structure not present anywhere, there's no, F group X, forget those people. There's no ad hominem jab either. So it's missing both the core assumptive error, which is that the assumption that concept Z is the be-all, end-all consideration. So not only is it missing that core flaw, it is also missing the ad hominem jab. And I've seen that the better looking answer has it, so I really don't like it. I really don't like E. So at the end of the day, it looks like C is the only one that holds up, so we're going to go with it. But we do want to note that C is imperfect. So yeah, as you just saw, a super in-depth generalization may not be rewarded word for word by the correct answer. We ended up with a Z prime instead of Z when looking at answer choice C, and the whole W thing turned out not to matter at all, as we were suspecting more and more as we went along. But even though we had those discrepancies, the overall structure of C was quite close to what we were looking for. It had that core assumptive flaw that factor Z is the be-all, end-all. It's the most important one, maybe even the only one that matters when we are deciding what to do about activity Y and all that other stuff. But really, I want to highlight this. Most importantly, our generalization let us see that all the other answers were clearly missing too many of our key elements. So just so we don't lose sight of the concept I've reproduced here at the top of this slide, our generalization let us see that all the other answers were missing too many key elements. The importance of this is the following. In my opinion, this exact sort of thing is why hard LR is as hard as it is. For basically everything else in life, we tend to want to have an affirmative reason to like something, rather than the sort of, well, I guess we're going to go with A because B, C, D, and E all suck worse. Many of us have probably been in that real life situation where none of our choices were very good and we just had to pick the lesser of several evils. But it's definitely not something that most of us need to do on a very frequent basis. It's probably happened again, to many of us in a variety of different situations, but it's not our usual way of doing things. But unfortunately for hard LR questions, liking the correct answer is often secondary to disliking 4 wrong answers here. So like we did in C, C sounded pretty good, at least in this case. It had a lot of the right parts, but it wasn't quite as firm of a exact parallel as I would have liked. But it was more or less there. All the same, it wasn't perfect, right? I only had a probably yes. This wasn't a solid yes for me like it was for the first question that we did. I had a pretty solid feeling that it was going to be A for the previous question. Here, for this question, not so much. But yeah, as we saw, even though our diagramming work and our generalization, all that stuff, didn't really give us 100% confidence, at least it didn't give me 100% confidence on C. It at least gave me a lot more confidence on all the rest of them. The closest thing to a trap answer was B, but again, that B was missing a key element, which was the ad hominem part that I was looking for, and because it was missing that, it just didn't feel quite as good as I wanted it to. Much more on the no end than on the yes end. So yeah, it's hard. It's difficult, I think, even to call that a trap. The real trap is just the task of generalizing the original stimulus, which kind of bounces all over the place and includes 4 variables if we count the sadly ignored W. But there was a lot of stuff going on, and our generalization didn't tell us that the right answer was 100% right. It looked pretty good, but it wasn't 100% right. But what our generalization did tell us is that all the rest were wrong for very, very specific reasons, and that's pretty important. Sure, you're all aware of how process of elimination works, but at the same time, to eliminate 4 and be left with one that doesn't look perfect, but you still have to go with it, that's not something that really comes easily or naturally to most of us, because that's not how we live our lives for the most part. And that brings us pretty much to the end. I do want to leave a parting note here. So generalizing parallel reasoning and parallel flaw arguments, as we saw, is useful in LR because it lets us get past all the specific facts and instead see the pattern of reasoning beneath all that stuff. But the ability to apply a similar filter to other poorly worded arguments can yield similar benefits on related question types, like method of argument in particular. Point at issue is another one. Principle is another very good one to practice generalization on, and many others. Basically anything that is not written very clearly, but you have to understand the logic behind it, you can kind of do this generalization. I do want to note that it especially helps on reading comp. This is a very good stealth tactic for reading comp. It helps you read faster and not get stopped cold by the weird stuff, and there is some weird stuff out there. And I think a lot of people are terrified that they will be unlucky on test day and be faced with that super hard weird passage. The weird passages are hard because they stop you cold when you're reading. You read it and then you don't get it. You end up rereading it. You still don't get it. Sometimes you think you do. You deceive yourself that after the 3rd time reading it, you got it, but you still didn't because you didn't magically gain some new knowledge. You didn't, you weren't able to Google it in the middle of everything, right, to figure out what it's actually saying. So that's a pace killer, and getting your pace killed on RC is pretty tough. The last thing that I want to note, aside from the broader applicability of this generalization skill to all of LR and a lot of RC, is that if you look at it, interestingly, the result of generalization on LR looks eerily similar to work you do in the LG section. At a certain point in LG, you stop seeing stuff like Jamaica or Stegosaurus or Mauve. And Mauve is a color, for those of you unfamiliar. It's from a relatively difficult game, which I demonstrated in a different video in my LR series. And really all you look at and all you work with mentally is the letter J, S, or lowercase m, and how those letters interact in a diagram. You stop seeing them as like actual things, and you see them as variables when you're working with diagrams. That's what you're doing. And I do believe that this proves my contention that I have, that all 3 sections do test the exact same thing. Your ability to see logical patterns regardless of context, and use that same insight, the ability to see the logic, to deal with situations where you're given insufficient information initially, and you're kind of tasked with piecing something together. So yeah, that's just kind of a note on how the exam works in general. And finally, the other thing I wanted to mention is that the other good news because of this is that a lot of people who talk to me, so a surprisingly increasing number of people come to me with this situation where you're actually getting a handle on LG. Yeah, sure, you're not getting -0s quite yet. You're not getting perfect sections, but you're getting it, and LG actually is kind of, you're afraid to admit it, but maybe even a little fun, right? It's not it's not the hardest thing in the world anymore. Um, and an increasing number of people are coming to me where they're pretty good at LG, or at least they have a solid handle on it. They're confident in their ability to get better. But RC is the problem section. They're missing like consistently 6 to 8 on RC, even though they're getting pretty close to acing LG. But the good news about the similarity of generalization in LR and the work that we do diagramming in LG is that, if you feel like you're getting a handle on LG, that probably means you can definitely handle LR and RC as well, because the only difference is that LG sometimes presents information to you pre-generalized. Sometimes they don't even give you names, they just give you letters, right? Building X, building Y, building Z, something like that. And a series of letters instead of actually named people. Well, you've seen that too, right? The only difference between that and LR is that the stuff that we did here, the exam didn't do it for us. The exam presented it to us in natural language, and it was our job to translate that natural language and squish it down into the variable language that LG lends itself more naturally to. So there is a lot more overlap that you think, and the overlap does go both ways. The paraphrasing stuff from LR does feed into your ability to work more rapidly, I think, in LG. Definitely does in RC. And LG, I think, also interestingly bleeds over into RC and LR in different ways. So yeah, that's pretty much all that I have for you guys today on this one. So if you made it this far, thanks for doing so. I'm pandering to the algorithm. Like and subscribe, that all helps. You have my email address here and also in the contact section of the channel. Any tutoring inquiries or any questions about the content should be directed to that email. And finally, if you need practice material, I will have in the pinned comment affiliate links to the LSAC's exams, all of which have been released thus far on Amazon. I think they're missing some of the most recent ones, or they just could be buried, but they're all there, easy to find, and I recommend using those because sometimes when you buy from unofficial sources or from alternate sources, there are non-official questions. And knowing how important language is to almost everything that we do on this exam, using anything other than official language is a big no-no. Don't do it.